My psychopathic mother made my life a living hell until I moved away from her, so as revenge, she stalked me and tried to frame me for heinous crimes. It backfired on her, and she went absolutely insane in the courtroom, plus all updates. I was at a bar celebrating my 21st birthday with some friends when my mother showed up wearing a wedding dress, her hair and makeup done in bridal style. When it was finally time for the cake, she took it upon herself to blow the candles out for me and started clapping for herself. When I got out of my seat to dance with one of my friends, my mother literally shoved her away midway through the dance and started dancing with me. I pried her off, and that's when she started screaming so loud the band stopped playing. She took my ear and tried to scold me, saying I was embarrassing her on her big day. She looked around, and at that moment, I think it clicked just how big of a scene she was making. The entire bar was silently staring at her, and the bar owner physically pushed her out while she yelled, but that was far from the end. You see, there is some context needed to really understand my mother. I was not only the only boy in the family, but also the youngest, which made me a perpetual baby in my mother's eyes. My mother often tried to infantilize me growing up. She tried to spoon-feed me when I was 17, then complained I wasn't being supportive of her when I refused to let her do things like that, then gaslit me when I didn't cave to her whining. Her behavior has been manipulative and narcissistic for as long as I can remember. She tended to make everything about her. Some referred to her as having a queen mother complex. She always expected to be honored and revered on any holiday, because even my birthdays had to be all about her, even when she did none of the work or planning. She had some other habits that were unbelievably creepy. When she was 45, she started openly talking to other people near me about wanting to get a facelift and honker implants to look 20 years younger, and she'd give me the side eye while doing it. But my father adamantly said he'd never pay for such unneeded things. That sparked many fights where she called him unsupportive, then would spend weeks playing the victim. She once put me on the spot trying to infantilize me in front of an entire church, my going up with me for the holy bread and trying to feed it to me. Then when I let her telling me to chew slowly, I was 22 and I just walked out. That was the last straw, and I moved out to rent a small room at a friend's parents' house for $200 a month. When I was packing to leave, she was begging me to stay almost the entire time. I told her I was her son, not her husband, and I was sick of the way she was acting around me. I had my own life to live after all. She just ran away sobbing and we didn't talk for months. I learned from my cousin that she was going around saying I'd come running back to her any day, but when I didn't, she lost it. My mother, even years after I became an adult, openly talked to me like a small child in front of other people and expected me to play along with it. And when I didn't, she'd first give me an expression like she was pleading with me, but I just stayed stone-faced. That made her grab me by the arm and try to drag me outside like a little kid to loudly whisper in my ear, but I always refused to let her and even threw her off a few times when she refused to let go. And the last time she attempted that, she dug her nails into my shoulder, so I swatted her hand away. That made her switch to mostly emotional manipulation. We both went to my uncle's birthday party, and while there, she was openly following me around and loudly talking to my aunt about the way I used to breastfeed as a child anytime she was close to me, and even said she lamented she couldn't still make me do that, then gave me that pleading look again. I wanted to throw up. My aunt was visibly disgusted as I'd told her about a lot of the previous things, but I guess she never really believed it was as bad as I said until that day. When I refused to cater to my mother at the party, she eventually broke down and loudly stated she was the matriarch and that what she says goes, then tried to order me to come to her, to which I reminded her that I didn't live with her anymore, nor did I have to do as she said because I wasn't a child. And then several other family members backed me up for the first time ever, which actually shocked me. That made my mother screech at us all and then leave, only to call me multiple times later to try and gaslight me over the phone. I let it all go to voicemail. Before making the choice to leave my home city, I had a girlfriend there I really liked. We'd been dating a few months and she wanted to meet my family. I was skeptical and warned her about my mother, but she must have thought I was joking. Boy, was she surprised. My mother was especially passive-aggressive towards her when they met, because she was taking her baby away, as we both heard her say to a relative over the phone in the kitchen when she thought no one else was listening. And then later, while cutting a cake she baked, my mother gave my at-the-time girlfriend an eerie stare while holding a large kitchen knife. Needless to say, that poor girl couldn't deal with my mother for very long, and we ended things amicably soon after because she never wanted to risk having someone like my mother as a mother-in-law. Sadly, I had to completely agree. So when I told my mother I was moving over 1,000 miles away, she went ballistic and tried to latch onto me and say that she wouldn't allow it. But I threw her off and said she didn't have the power to stop me. I'd saved as much as I could for years and bought a truck and camper trailer and spent another 2 years living out of said camper while working a simple job in Northern Cali. During this time, I didn't bother to keep in contact with any family at all. Eventually, I met someone new, and she and I are still together to this day, though neither of us are really interested in marriage or children. When I finally broke the NC with my parents in 2016, I laid down some ground rules. They were to treat me with the respect of an adult. They would not pester my girlfriend, and they would not speak to me like a child or bring up anything from my childhood. Well, no surprise, my mother couldn't do any of those when we actually came to visit for Thanksgiving. So I told her I was done, and not to bother calling me until she realized I'm a grown man. She tried to block the door and started quoting the Bible about how parents should be respected by their children. I told her she didn't respect me, so I wouldn't respect her. In December of that year, I got multiple calls, emails, and texts from her begging me to come to Christmas and not to bring my girlfriend. I said if she wasn't welcome, then neither was I. She called me unreasonable and called my girlfriend an interloping whore to our special bond, and no woman should come between a mother and her son, then practically ordered me to go. When I refused, she started making empty threats of self-harm. I told her she can do what she likes with her own body, but I would not be coming to Christmas and would instead be spending it with my girlfriend's family. My mother said I'd regret that decision and ended the call in a rage. Well, 2 days before Christmas, the door to the small house my girlfriend and I were renting was kicked in by police who were convinced that we were running a dope lab. We were detained and interrogated while police turned our yard into a veritable flea market, as a lot of our furniture and personal belongings were brought outside and arranged in rows to be inspected. They went through the house with a fine-toothed comb with sniffing dogs and found nothing more than aspirin and some medication I had at the time for depression. Needless to say, they were visibly disappointed by that. Guess they'd hoped to get some big bust or something. Turns out this all happened because my crazy mother had called them and gave details that were so accurate she had to have been stalking us at some point. She claimed that I was using my camper as a front to sell dope. My guess is she watched a lot of Breaking Bad. When police found nothing in the house, both vehicles and the camper, they were forced to put everything back and let us go. Understandably, we were furious, but I couldn't really do anything other than file a complaint because they'd caused some damage to the house that my landlord was angry about. As a major stroke of karma, my mother was arrested during her own Christmas Day party in front of most of the family. The investigation later showed that she'd taken a flight to my state and then spent a few days following us around taking pictures of me, my girlfriend, and our home. She'd broken in and photographed everything she could, right down to the underwear in my dresser. That was especially creepy. And police found she'd documented where I worked and what times my girlfriend and I were usually home or at our jobs. We're not really sure what her overall goal was, but it likely involved more than just trying to give me a scare with cops. Update. While I did press charges on my mother for stalking me and trying to frame me, I didn't want to spend much time in court because that meant being near her. So the events I'm about to describe are half from me and half from my dad. To start off with, my dad actually didn't know that my crazy mother had taken a flight to my state to stalk me. She claimed to him that she was just going to take a small vacation away from everyone for her own mental health, and never said where she was going, and my poor dad didn't know what she was about to do, or he'd have warned me. My mother then spent several days secretly following me and my GF around with her smartphone. She used the spare key we kept hidden inside of a fake rock to get into the house we were living in at the time. She then photographed everything she could. Then, after she returned home, my dad said she looked really smug about something. He described it as the kind of look someone has when they think they've won, and she seemed unusually happy and giddy until police came and arrested her on Christmas. Dad said she was bawling her eyes out and saying she didn't do anything wrong as she was being carted out by the cops. The evidence against her was clear. All of the photos were found on her phone, and my dad quickly realized what she'd done. The call my mother made to claim I was selling, she even made from her own smartphone. The call was recorded and was very much traced back to her phone quite easily. When my mother was confronted with the evidence, my dad said she just started crying and begging, and when she refused to get up from the table, the police had to move her. Dad said she just totally went limp and refused to cooperate. No one bailed her out of jail either. She had to use her own money to get herself out. Dad said she wanted to call me to beg, but I guess in a rare moment of clarity, she figured out there was no way in hell I'd bail her out out after what she did, so she spent a while locked up before finally using her own money to get out. She didn't try to run. In fact, she firmly believed herself to be justified in what she'd done and felt like she could sway a judge to her point of view. Her lawyer advised she just plead guilty, so she fired him and said she'd represent herself. Well, that went about as well as you can imagine. She was in court faster than I thought, and my GF and I had to fly over to testify against my mother, but I only stayed as long as they needed me, and I was on the first flight I could get back. But while I was there, my mother seemed to stare at me almost constantly. The stares ranged from her creepy, pleading look to absolute rage. When my mother took the stand, she gave a speech about why she believed she was right. I needed to be taught a lesson for refusing to come home and for putting some woman before her, because she should have been the only woman I'd ever need. She also tried to keep staring at me the entire time she was making this speech, but the judge repeatedly told her not to do that. I left before the sentencing. The judge believed my mother to be mentally unwell, but when he stated this, she went off on him that she was completely sane. Of course, that just made her look more crazy. She said she was just a mother looking out for her son and did what she had to do to teach me a lesson. My dad spoke up and said if she was really looking out for me, she wouldn't have tried to make her own son into her second husband or frame me for stuff I didn't do. That made her go off on him, and guards had to keep them apart. The judge was originally going to be more lenient on my mother, but decided she needed some real time behind bars and sentenced her to 2 years in prison. When she was sentenced, my mother went full toddler and had a tantrum of pounding her fists and crying like a baby. She had to be carried out of the courtroom because she refused to cooperate again. My dad described the next 2 years without her there as being absolute bliss, and made up his mind that he'd be ready to divorce her as soon as she was out, and I mean giving her the papers on the very day she came home, and that was the same day he left that house for good. He owns an Airstream trailer and parked it at a friend's house. From there, he spent months fighting my crazy mother in the divorce. That's when more crazy shit about her came out. My dad eventually won and moved to my state with his trailer as soon as he could. While my mother was in lockup, I reconnected with my family, and they all admitted they'd known for years the way she was around me, and they were sorry about not doing anything to help, especially my father. He cried while giving me a huge apology over the phone. He filed for divorce after my mother was released from jail, and in the divorce my mother got the house, mainly because my father no longer wanted it and agreed to let her have his share in it in exchange for a clean split. The court ruled he didn't have to pay any alimony anyway, because they were already both retired, so he chose to move closer to me and now lives in the same state out of an Airstream trailer he'd already owned since the 90s along the West Coast. He said he spends his evenings sipping tea and watching the waves, and he couldn't be happier. My mother didn't take the divorce well and tried to draw it out, but several family members came forward with witness statements. My sisters all showed up to speak about what she was really like, and some relatives even had some recordings about the creepy things my mom used to say. On top of all that, it got out that my mother had not only cheated on my father, but done so multiple times with different men, a few of which came forward during the divorce with proof. The judge ended up refusing to let my mother draw out the divorce any longer, and even her lawyer told her to let it go if she wanted to keep her pension intact. And when it was all over, my mother has basically been left alone in the old family home, and hardly anyone wants anything to do with her anymore. She's reached out to me on several occasions, but I just told her this was the result of her own deeds, and now she'd have to live with it. She tried to say she was getting therapy, but I told her that she should have done that a long time ago, and I really didn't care anymore because she can't undo the things she'd already done. She just cried and hung up the phone. I haven't spoken to her since.